So it is my honor to introduce our keynote speaker for today, John Powell. John Powell is the director of the Haas Institute for a Fair and Inclusive Society and professor of law, ethnic studies, and African American studies at UC Berkeley. The Haas Institute brings together scholars, organizers, communicators, and policymakers to identify and eliminate the barriers to an inclusive, just, and sustainable society, and to create transformative change towards a more equitable nation. As you all know in this room, John is an internationally recognized social justice warrior, an expert in the areas of civil rights, civil liberties, structural racialization, housing, concentrated poverty, narrative change, and democracy, and jazz, just to mention a few things. His recent book, Racing to Justice, Transforming Our Conceptions of Self and Other to Build an Inclusive Society, offers us a way to think deeply about our shared humanity, how we want to be as a society, and a way forward so that we can actually live up to the promise of an inclusive democracy where everyone belongs. And we're really lucky that there's some copies of his book for sale at the back of the room. But the main thing I really want to stress about John is that John is an amazingly inspiring, caring human being, a real patient teacher, and incredibly generous thought partner to many of us in this room, including the California Endowment. He's also an incredibly busy man, and so we are really fortunate that he is here today with us right before he takes off to England for another engagement. So please join me in giving John a really warm NFG welcome.
Good morning. You know, I am busier than I'd like to be, but also I'm in a very privileged position, and I just want to acknowledge that privilege. Let me take this off. I'm not gonna take any phone calls. And I'm sure you've done this already, but before I start on my remarks, I'd like to just, take a minute of silence for the lives that was lost in Florida, for rape victims around the world, for people suffering from war and famine, and just to acknowledge the deep suffering that's going on and ground our work in just how important it is. Thank you. So I was asked to talk about othering and belonging, which is a big topic, something I think about all the time. And let me first tell you how we came to that phrase. And we have a journal I think it's going to be online next week, Othering and Belonging. And then there'll be a hard copy following that. As Sandra said, I'm director of the Haas Institute. We have 7 clusters. And the clusters range from LGBTQ, disability, race, immigration, gender, and I'm sure I'm leaving out many. And I thought, so what are these different clusters, these different experiences of people have in common? What's the thread? How does LGBT and disability and race and immigration, religion, how do they relate to each other? And what occurred to me is that they're all different ways of talking about othering and belonging. How do we actually define who belongs, and how do we define who's other? And so we came up with the concept of othering and belonging. And we've been fortunate, I'm fortunate, because it's probably not many people who can come to an event like this and not only see a lot of funders, but see a lot of friends, people who I really enjoy seeing. And I just wish I had more time to spend more time with you, both to enjoy the friendship and try to get some of your money. Othering and belonging. The different ways that we other and the expressions of it, we see every day. And some of it happens on an interpersonal level. All of us have been in a situation where we literally felt like, this is home. I can exhale. I can take off my jacket. And then we walked in places like, oh, whoa, this is not my place. I don't belong here. How long do I have to stay? And all of us have had that experience at an interpersonal level. Students have that experience walking into a classroom, and it's like, this is not my classroom. We did a project with the endowment looking at schools in Oakland, and we found that a lot of the Black and Latino students who were not going into AP classes, they weren't going not because they didn't have the chops to do the work. They'd walk into a class and it's like, whoa, not my place, I'm not staying here. I mean, literally they told us that they walked into a place and they felt like, I don't belong. And that has huge implications. So there's interpersonal, but there's also things that happen at the structural institutional level. And I'm reminded of, and I had my research assistant look for some quotes about the meeting between James Baldwin and Margaret Mead years ago when both of them was at the top of their game. And they have this rambling 8-hour conversation with each other. It's actually a book about Mead and Baldwin, which you can get, where at some point Baldwin says to Margaret Mead, you know, it must be hard for you being a woman, intellectual, a writer in a man's world. You must feel a sense of not belonging. And I'm paraphrasing, but she responds, are you kidding? You know, I'm white, I'm privileged, I'm upper middle class, I'm respected. I feel like I belong everywhere I go. I feel at home everywhere. And then she turns to Baldwin, who at the time is living in Paris, and is like, and what about you? Where do you feel like you belong now that you're in Paris and not New York? And Baldwin at that time is recognized as probably the world's greatest writer or poet. And his response is, I don't feel like I belong anywhere. And that's amazing to me. Here's this person at the top of his game, revered by many people, but the fact that he was Black and gay left a sense of not belonging anywhere. And so it's not simply that some of us may not belong at a party or in a certain situation. There are groups of people that have a very difficult place finding a place they can belong. And of course, what we're trying to do, and what you're supporting, is sort of constructing a world where all people belong all the time. And now, it may not be something that we can easily attain, but it's the North Star. It actually points to our work. And when we have government policies and norms that say to groups of people, you don't belong, in fact, we're going to build a wall to emphasize the fact that you don't belong. We're going to create a database to follow you around to say that you don't belong. We're going to create segregated schools and segregated hospitals to say that you don't belong. It has a particularly pernicious function. So we're not just talking about psychological and emotional events. We're talking about how we order our society, how we structure our society. And so I think when we think about othering and belonging, it tells us not just how people feel, it tells us how to think about social policy, how to think about structures, how to think about how we orient our work. The Northwest Area Foundation, and I've written about this, and that's why I don't mind mentioning their name, and I don't think they would mind. They asked me years ago to write something about reducing poverty in marginalized communities, Black, Latino, Native American, and so on. And I said, I'd be happy to do that, except it's a waste of time, and it'll be a waste of your money. And they said, well, why do you say that? I said, literally, there are hundreds of policies out there about how to address poverty. No one's paying attention to them. It's not that they're not smart. It's not that they're not right. It's that the objects of those policies, the people that you're focusing on, are not considered people. The function is not a policy problem. The problem is we see some people as not people. Now, we can actually measure that. So it's not just something we can say analytically. We can measure, and which has been measured, who is considered people in the United States. There's a part of the brain that lights up when you see another human being. And there's a test based on how warmly you feel towards someone, how competent you think they are. And when you think people are very competent and you feel very warm about them, the brain just lights up. That's my posse. You know, smart, cool, I really like them, can dance. And then there are people that, when we see them, we don't feel warm toward them. nor do we like them, nor do we think they're competent. And when people fall into this category, the part of the brain that normally lights up when we see a human being doesn't light up. We literally, at an unconscious level, don't see some people as people. And some of the groups, it won't surprise you, homeless people, undocumented immigrants, ex-offenders, young black men. And in some groups they hit on one axis and not the other. So for example, with women in our society, and this is a national test, we like women as a society, but we don't think, so we have the warm feeling toward them, but we don't think they're that competent. About 20% of Americans don't think that a woman, any woman, not Hillary, any woman, Hillary, Elizabeth Warren, my mother, should be president. So if you don't think people are people, it's hard to develop policy to support them. So sometimes we go straight to the policy question. There's a quote by some feminists that say that the history of the United States can be written on who is considered a person. And of course, we all know about Dred Scott, where the court said no black, free or otherwise, can ever be part of the political community. In a sense, we're still fighting that struggle. Now, I want to pivot a little bit and sort of suggest why this is so important, and then what we can do about it, and a different way of understanding it. So I've already suggested that how we think about each other is really important. But oftentimes when we approach these problems, we approach them as simply a policy problem, economic, political. So we think, well, there's all this stuff, and if we could just give people money, things would be fine. Or, in the day's parlance, political discourse, there's been study after study showing that America is deeply, deeply anxious. Americans are scared. And what may surprise you is that one of the most scared group, based on some measures, and the most angry group in America are not young black kids getting shot by the police, not Latinos being afraid of being deported. They're afraid too. But the group that's most afraid are white men. Almost 2 to 1. White men are twice as likely to be angry and afraid as blacks. What are they afraid of? You know, by many standards, they have what most of us think we want. They have white privilege. They have a dominant role in society. They have a lock on the presidency until maybe Obama came along. So what are they afraid of? And what some people say, well, we have this economic engine. There's a loss of job. There's globalization. There's China. And all that's right. But it's not the whole story, and it's radically incomplete. What I want to suggest is that people organize their sense of selves on several different axes. One of them, economic. How much stuff you have matters in some sense. After a certain point, it doesn't matter, but it matters certainly at the low end. Political efficiency, a sense of power and agency, that matters. So we know that economics matter and politics matter. But the third axis, we actually don't pay much attention to, and that is our sense of self, our collective sense of self. And I see you had Jeff Chang here, I think yesterday, and his book, Who We Be, is sort of an interesting bookend to another book called Who Are We? By Samuel Huntington. Samuel Huntington's book looks to the past. It looks to an imaginary past when America was, in his mind, controlled and settled by two groups, Anglos and Saxons, who were English-speaking, Protestant, hardworking. And he said, this is who we are. And we need to reclaim those roots. And if people come and they don't adhere to the norms and principles and values, we should be comfortable telling them they don't belong and they should leave. That's Huntington. Jeff Chang says, all this diversity is happening and we're becoming something new. And it's a struggle. But we can become something great. So one's looking at an imaginary past, the other one's looking at a possible future. But that possible future, in a sense they both acknowledge, is essentially, no pun intended, driving the country crazy. Diversity is actually very scary to people. And Putnam wrote about this in the 90s in the European context, saying as Europe became more diverse, you're going to see a strain on public good and social policy. And when he wrote that, he got blasted. He wasn't saying there was going to be economic strain. He wasn't saying the economy was going to collapse. He was saying diversity itself was going to create anxiety. And I have a diagram where I show growing diversity creates growing anxiety. That anxiety can take different forms. And one form is anger and fear. The other form is empathy and belonging. Which form does it take? Well, what mediates that are a number of things, but three in particular. One is leadership. Two is narrative. What are the stories we tell about ourselves and others? And the third are structures themselves. So the narrative work becomes really important. And the narrative work is not just telling a story, it's telling a story about who we are and who we want to be. How are we related to each other or not? Is there an us and a them? And so part of the thing that makes growing diversity hard for people is that the us and the them are related. The other is used to define who I am. So to some extent, the challenge of diversity is, can we construct a sense of self where we're deeply related instead of being deeply competitive? And so there are two mechanisms in the social science world. One is called bridging, which basically says, there's something about you that I can connect to. I can connect with your group. And I'll tell stories about interconnection. The other one is called bonding or closure, which is that I close in on my group and everybody not in my group is a potential threat and enemy. I want to suggest to you that the dominant work going on in the country, largely on the right and left, is bonding or closure, not bridging. We're not finding ways of connecting to each other. And yet we know that each other is both a threat and an opportunity. That I am because you are. You change me. And sometimes I don't want to be changed. And that's threatening. And so what Huntington is saying, and I would say what the far right is saying, is that we're being changed by all these dynamics happening in the country. And what people who are left of center are most likely to say is that there's no change that's going to happen. So we take gay marriage. And the right wing says, this is going to destroy the institution of marriage. Our response is, no, the institution is going to stay exactly as it was. We're just going to bring gays and lesbians and queers into that role. Think about that. Now, I think both of those are false. That is that gay marriage is not going to destroy marriages, but it is going to change it. And it should change it. And as Ruth Bader Ginsburg said, it needs to be changed. When she says, so we want to protect the institution of marriage, right? Where men dominate women, where men were allowed to beat women. That's the institution we want to protect. We do want to evolve to something different. Just a week ago, and there's a film being made about this, great name, a film about the Loving family. And the Loving family was a family that decided to, a white man and a black woman decided to get married when it was against the law. And their name was Loving. Great name, right? And again, the right wing went ballistic. Miscegenation is what we used to call it, miscegenation. And so we had anti-miscegenation laws of saying you can't have mixture between the races. And part of the right wing's fear of school integration was that if black children and white children go to school together, they said some of them might get married. And some married people even have sex. And the civil rights movement's response was, no, this is not about marriage, and it's certainly not about sex. This is just about education. Fast forward. In 2010, and Dennis has heard these numbers from me before, 2010, 15% of the marriages in the United States is what's called intermarriages. That is, people of different race and ethnicities marrying. 15%. And the number in California at that time was over 20%. In terms of families, 40% of the families in the country, 40% were interfamilies. That is, there's someone in the family of a different race or ethnicity. And the projection is that in a relatively short period of time, that will hit 60%. California is already ahead of that. California is probably already at probably in the 30% in terms of intermarriage, and probably at 50 or 60% in terms of interfamilies. What does that mean? I don't know. But it means something. And in a sense, the right wing was right. That even though we still have segregated schools, people are finding each other, and like the Lovings, they're loving each other. And they're trying to be together. And so I'm sure many of you saw the ad where it was an ad where interracial couple was on the ad. And again, the right wing said they're going to boycott because they're promoting race mixing. And they're afraid about that. Thinking about the one-drop rule, they're afraid of what will happen if the races come together. And they're not the only ones afraid. The anxiety is something that we feel a lot. And the unconscious anxiety is actually higher than the conscious anxiety. And it's true not just for the right, it's actually true for the left as well. And we need a story, we didn't need a narrative that lets us imagine us really being together. And more than imagining it, how do we then, after we get a story, which humanizes everyone, which says that we all belong in the circle of human concern, how do we then construct policies, rules, norms that actualize that? It's not saying we all become each other, but we will change each other. This is an experiment. So I talked about people who are in intermarriages, that is, married to someone of a different race or ethnicity, or have someone in the family of a different race or ethnicity. If that describes your family or your life, just stand up. I look around the room. Okay, you can sit down. So this is the America that's already here. But we don't have a structure, a way of holding it. We don't have a way of talking about it. And we need to acknowledge that, yes, some people are afraid. I wrote a piece in Huffington Post and on our blog about what happened in Orlando. And when I wrote it, some of my friends were disturbed because I said, while we celebrated the right for gay marriage, and I joined in that celebration in a very big way, there were some people who were mourning. And it's easy for us to say, you lost, so go mourn. You know, that's your problem. But I don't think we want to say that. I don't want to go back to the right to gay marriage, but we need to actually acknowledge that people are afraid, that there's something going on. Because what happens with people like Donald Trump is they tap into and they exacerbate the fear. And out of that, then, they talk about policies. And our response, by and large, is to say, don't be afraid, or the fear is irrational. The mind doesn't work like that. We need to have a deeper story. We need to have deeper experiences. And we have to be very conscious, both in terms of our stories, in terms of our analysis, in terms of our testing, to figure out what can we do to create a sense of real belonging in a new world, in a world where whites will no longer be the majority, in a world where people of all different stripes can love each other and be together. That's the story we need to tell. So I'm going to end with just a couple of quick thoughts and then have a few minutes for conversation. The world that I worked with some Aborigines people, and some are coming shortly to the United States to do some more work in Australia and other places. And they talked about being born into a world and being prepared to live in a world that no longer exists. The world around them is changing so fast that their culture, the world they were born into, is going away. Now, in that situation, what's happening is that someone's imposing a new world on them where they don't get to participate. It's clear to me that a new world is in the process of actually being born. And it shouldn't be imposed by the elites or by anybody else. People should participate in it. And we should make this new world together. But we have to figure out how to do that. So whether it's, I just talked to Ed, whether it's in Detroit, Detroit's being made into a new city. Poor people are not participating in making that city. Somebody else has an idea of what Detroit should be. How do we make sure that everyone get to participate? Sometimes we call that civic participation, but that's too thin of a word to really capture what I'm talking about. How do we actually create structures, opportunities, situation, stories that actually celebrate our emerging belonging? I don't know where we're going in this world, but I do know that we have to heal what I call 4 splits. One is our split from nature. The second is our split or separation from each other. Our third is our split from ourselves. And for people who are religious, like my father, he would say our separation from God. How do we actually begin to actually deal with that in a way that allow people to come together? So some of you may have seen Romney's quote on Trump. If you haven't, I would encourage you to do that. And you might think, Romney? Why am I talking about Romney? Isn't he part of the evil empire? His quote is actually beautiful. He gives an interview, and he talks about Trump creating what he calls trickle-down racism. And then the interviewer says, so what would Trump need to do to pivot for you? What would he need to do so you can support him? And Romney's response is quite remarkable. He says, this is not about a policy. This is not about performance. Trump has said something that tears at the core of America. And he said, basically, I can never support him. And again, to me, that was so powerful about that he's saying there's something deeper than policies. There's something deeper than strategies. And to hear it from an unlikely source as Romney is even all the more powerful. So I encourage you to really dig deep, continue to support, many of you already have, but to think about your work in a different way, to make sure that the issue of belonging is key. And the last thing I'll say is that the change that's happening in the world is remarkable. And sometimes we don't see change until it's over. What do I mean by that? There's been articles written that there's being a realignment of politics in the country. Part of that's being pushed by people, ordinary people, Bernie Sanders, Donald Trump. There's a realignment of political structures in the country. It's huge. It doesn't happen every election. This is huge. There's also, some people suggest, a realignment of our economy. That we're actually making a new economy. And those things are related. But what most people miss is that there's also a realignment of who we are. That we are changing. We're changing into something different. And how do we actually make that change, again, so that no one is left outside of the circle of human concern? And with your help and good work, I believe we can do that. And now I'll entertain a couple of questions or comments. Thank you. And I think there are mics on either side, so if you want to ask a question or make a comment, if you could go to the mic.
How would you frame the way that we might counter fear as the core response to anxiety?
Great question. So for those of you who can hear, saying fear is a powerful motivator. What might we do to counter fear as a response to anxiety? And I sort of prefigured it already. You're right. And fear, by some accounts, fear is one of the oldest and most powerful emotions, not just in humans, but other animals as well. And what I suggested is that fear is actually secondary, that what we experience first is anxiety. That we're having some deep anxiety that's roiling the entire country. And it's not just in the white communities, in the black communities, in the Latino community, not all the same, but it's there. And the anxiety, it stirs around. It's like I don't feel comfortable. There's a recent study showing that the vast majority of every group, whites, Latinos, blacks, upper middle class, Native American, every group feels powerless and anxious. Every group. No one feels like they're on top of it. So you have this really fertile ground. So one of the things is to become more familiar with that, but also to acknowledge it. To say, yeah, Dennis, I know, it's maybe, it's not feeling great this morning driving into traffic, and I felt that too. Instead, what we do, or more likely to do, is that if you feel anxious about the country becoming more diverse, you must be a racist. So, and that's essentially has been the national position until Trump came along, is that we would say, diversity, yay, and the unconscious would be saying, diversity, ah, and the unconscious is actually in some ways more important than the conscious. And what Trump did was to help people take that and give it voice. We had essentially tried to silence it. Yeah. And I'm not saying we have to give in to the anxiety, but we have to acknowledge it. And then it can be directed. Anxiety is just, in a sense, nebulous energy that can go in multiple directions. What we do with that anxiety as a society, from my perspective, as I suggested, is we actually hunker down. We have closure. And we create greater and greater stories about us and them. The reason you feel anxious is because of those people. And this is being used strategically by the elites to do two things. So it's not that they're principal racists, they're strategic racists, as Ian Annie Lopez would say. They use that to actually attack the role of government on one hand, and to restructure the economy to actually send more resources to the elite. So they're doing it for strategic reasons. And if you don't like Latinos, cut taxes. If you don't like Muslims, deregulate. And this actually comes out of the civil rights movement, because the civil rights movement, again, the elites were able to say the government had this forced integration, destroyed your community. So it's not only black people and Latinos are bad because they want to be part of you. We already are part of each other. But the government is bad because government was engaging in inappropriate activity. And so we have to attack government. So if you go back to the 1960s, American support for government was around 60%, in the high 60s. Today it's around 16%. So part of it is understanding the vehicle. The government plays a critical role in terms of policies and in terms of stories. But all of us need to sort of participate in telling a story that acknowledges the anxiety, and then create a pathway where we're together that actually brings us together, that draws in connection. And we don't do a good job of that.
So I have a comment question, so something I think about a lot. We talked yesterday about power, and I was the economic power guy. I think when we look at the history of right-wing economics, the most influential book that describes right-wing economics is fiction. It's Ayn Rand's books. It's more influential than Hayek, it's more influential than Friedman, because it tells a story about who we are. So that's thought one. Thought two is, at some level, culture is a wholesale project, all right? And we're immersed in TV and there's lots of fiction everywhere. But, what you're talking about, sort of breaking down the barriers of the other, is sort of we got to do that at the retail level, right? That's a human connection that you have to make. So do you have thoughts on how to connect those two ends of the cultural project that we've got to take on?
Well, you're certainly right. Culture is very important. So most of us get our stories, and even calling them stories is actually a misnomer. My father's a Christian minister. He's 95 years old. He doesn't think of the Bible as a story. So when we talk about narrative, it is a story, when, especially, if you teach at Berkeley, you can't say it's real, right? But anyway, it's my father's life. And all of us live in stories. And the stories we live in, we don't call stories. It's like reality. It's what some people call ideology. And culture plays a big role in that. And one of the stories we tell in the United States is that we're all separate individuals. We all can do it on our own, even when we know it's not true. None of us gave birth to ourselves. None of us sort of put our own diapers on. So the stories, the myths, what Joseph Campbell talked about, are very, very powerful. But if you look at movies and theater, they sort of repeat those myths. So the point is that we can tell counter myths. We can tell counter stories. And I believe people hunger for relationships, hunger for love, hunger for connection, and not in a quote-unquote soupy way. How do we actually legitimize that? How do we repeat that over and over again? How do we help people make it happen? I'll end by just saying this. Think about where some of the best examples of belonging has happened in the United States. First of all, think about changing racial demographics. Whiteness, as we think about it today, only came into being in the 1940s and 50s. Before that, white people were something else. And they were Italian Americans, German Americans. They didn't think of themselves as white as much as ethnic groups. I was born in 1947. I was born a colored boy. Later, I became a Negro. Malcolm X said, "Stop being a Negro and be black." And he wasn't just saying, change the label. He was saying, change who you are. What I'm saying, the change is happening. We need to participate in very sophisticated ways to help give birth. We need to all be midwives to help give birth to something different, where it's okay to love, where it's okay to recognize our interconnectedness, and then develop structures around that, and make sure the elites don't hijack the government in terms of policies that are inclusive. Thank you.